On the 1st of October, in response to an Israeli assassination of a dignitary in Tehran, Iran launched a nearly 200 missile barrage into parts of Israel. In response to that, immediately after, you had many of the leaders of Israel, especially Netanyahu, talking about how they are going to emphatically respond. And yet now here we are on the 24th of October, and there still has been no response. Now, the question is going to be, what does that mean? Does it mean that they're reconsidering whether they should do it? Is there some other reason behind it? And what may come next? And we have one of the best guests that we have on this show from Europe right now, Colonel Jacques Baud, former member of the Swiss Strategic Intelligence Service, former NATO officer, and just exceptional military analyst. Colonel, welcome back to the show.
Thank you for inviting me again. Thank you. Hi.
Well, listen, that's kind of the question of the day. There's been people really been speculating for quite a while now about when this is going to come, because Israeli leaders keep on saying it's going to come, and yet it doesn't seem to come. So, first of all, let me show you just the strength with which some of these leaders have said this. I mean, here was Netanyahu just hours after the attack on 1 October.
Tonight, Iran again attacked Israel with hundreds of missiles. This attack failed. Iran made a big mistake tonight, and it will pay for it. The regime in Iran does not understand our determination to defend ourselves and our determination to retaliate against our enemies.
And then even the next morning on Fox News, Ambassador Danon said this.
What happened last night in Israel was not a defensive action of Iran. It was a calculated attack on a civilian population. Israel will not stand by in the face of such aggression. Israel will respond. Our response will be decisive. And yes, it will be painful.
Now, first of all, just let me ask what your thought was when you were watching those in the first couple of days. I personally thought something was going to be coming quickly within a matter of days. Obviously, that has been proven wrong. What was your thoughts initially?
Well, I think both Israel and Iran are in a very difficult position because with the attack on the consulate of Damascus in February or March this year, Israel launched a kind of a, if you allow me the expression, kind of a pissing contest. And both countries are now trying to demonstrate that they have the ability to strike, but they don't want, or let's say they're reluctant to start a regional war. And the problem is that Iran responded on the 13th of April with a limited strike, which was extremely well calibrated, extremely well, let's say, planned, because most of the flying objects, there were drones, cruise missiles, and ballistic missiles, most of them were designed to be destroyed in order to saturate the air defense of Israel and allow a few strike on selected objectives. And in fact, Iran reached all the objectives without any human loss. I mean, it was only one by accident. In the second strike, in the 1st of October, the same thing. And then Israel tried to respond, and they responded with by some kind of cruise missile or drone attack that was in fact defeated by Iran. And then came the Ismail Haniyeh assassination in Tehran. And here Iran had to respond because it was a matter of credibility, a matter of national sovereignty, and also because it's not the first time that Israel is striking Iran. Iran had to show that they are determined not to allow further violation of its sovereignty. Therefore, Iran had to respond. They had to respond slightly stronger than in April, but not too strong in order to avoid, again, this, let's say, to trigger a regional war. So it is in that a very, very narrow window of response, if you want. And Israel is exactly in the same situation. And that's the reason why I was not surprised not to have an immediate reaction, because they have to carefully plan their operation in order to avoid something that goes totally out of control. And in fact, Yoav Gallant, who is now on the picture, said that there will be a response, but this response will be painful, precise, and and surprising. So these were the three criteria, meaning that we have to be very careful. The first responses from Iran were of ballistic nature, with missiles and cruise missile and all that. We may have a different type of response from Israel, meaning that everybody expects some air attack or something like that, but it might be something different. We may well have something like we had with Ismail Haniyeh, for example. And instead of having something extremely big and with a lot of explosion and all that, we may have something less, let's say, spectacular in a certain sense, but with a spectacular strategic effect, like elimination or assassination of President Pezeshkian, or even Ali Khamenei, or something like that. What I was surprised about was precisely this definition or the declaration of Yoav Gallant about this response, that would be painful, precise, and surprising, meaning that it's something that Iran doesn't expect. And that may...
You saw the strikes that Iran launched against us a short time ago. Those strikes were aggressive, but they failed because they weren't accurate. Just as we have been doing until now in the war on all other fronts, whoever attacks us will be hurt and will pay a price. Our attack will be deadly, precise, and above all, surprising. They will not understand what happened or how it happened. They will see the results.
Right. So, yeah, so you see that's kind of what you just said. But here's the question there. One of the other statements that he made, and I think it was even yesterday, he made it from in front of some of the Israeli Air Force jets, and he was saying that we're going to see the skill and the determination of their air power. So implying that that's going to play some role in what's going on with that.
Well,
whatever he does.
Well, the problem is that, first of all, I'm not in the mind of Mr. Gallant, and I'm not even in I don't know the secret of the Israeli General Staff planning. But I think the problem is that Israel cannot respond with unlimited force. I mean, there is a point where the use of force will be so extreme that it can trigger something that is completely out of control for everybody. And I think that's also the concern of the US, because they see that Israel can answer in a way that can trigger something much broader that the US doesn't want. And that's probably, by the way, even if I don't know the exact motivation behind this, but that might be the rationale behind the leakage of the two top secret documents that were revealed or published very recently in an attempt to show the Israelis that the US is ready to stop any kind of cooperation. I mean, they will not be the ally for any kind of response. And therefore, they might be a point where the US may be able to take measures to prevent a totally uncontrolled type of response. That's probably the message behind this. I have no idea, but that's a possible that's a possible rationale behind this these leaks document.
Yeah, and you know what? There's some that actually are speculating that the fact of that leak has had that impact, and that is one of the reasons why there hasn't been a response so far. But I think that there's some plausibility to that, more so than say somebody who wants to just share some information or so. We've had a lot of leaks over the past from whistleblowers or from people who on the inside who didn't want a certain course of action, so they released it. But it's interesting, and I think telling perhaps, that this was a single document, or a 2-page document basically, and not like a trove of information or so. It didn't talk anything about what the Israeli plans were. It just talked about what the preparation that they have done, and you can kind of read between the lines about what may be coming, but even that doesn't tell anything about it. So that would, I think, tend more towards what you suggested, that this could be a calibrated leak intentionally by the government.
Yeah, and probably with the intent, with the hidden intent of saying, if you want to proceed in something bigger, then we will leak more. In that sense, I don't know. I have no idea. But again, I'm trying to make sense of what we see.
Yeah.
An interesting point, though, in the document, if you read them, it indicates that there is no indication of nuclear preparation. That's an interesting point. It's an interesting point. So we can interpret this in different ways, obviously, but my take is that this was an attempt from the US to regain some kind of control over the decision making in Israel. And the problem is that we have, and I think indicated that already on your channel a couple of times, and that applies both to Ukraine and to Israel, is that after the US has triggered all these conflicts, and I even fed them with arms delivery and all that, today they see that these conflicts are getting out of control. Both Zelensky, and that was very clear with the attack he launched on the Kursk Oblast, and Israel, and that was obviously the case with the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran, that the US had not been informed before. They had no knowledge of these action, and therefore I think there's a concern. I mean, that's my interpretation. There's a concern in the U.S. administration that these two leaders, Zelensky and Netanyahu, may launch something on their own without consulting the U.S. Just for the sake of creating a situation in which the U.S. have no other choice than intervening. And that's probably what the Israelis are aiming at.
And well, that's kind of what I'm thinking too, because when let's broaden the lens back a little bit, but I mean, you can see when Israel attacked the consulate compound, the Iranian consulate compound in Syria, that was a major breach of international protocol, and something that had been centuries long, as we've had other members of the diplomatic corps talking about on here. Very provocative. And then you had the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh, not just in Tehran, which by itself would have been a lot, but during the presidential inauguration itself, which again was highly, highly emotional, which ordinarily would prompt a strike. So it looks like Israel is trying to draw Iran into this, and therefore the message from the U.S. may not be very effective. Now, you put on top of that, last week we put on the show, here's a soundbite from Naftali Bennett. He's done this plenty of times, where he's saying, hey, let's go after the nuclear facility. This is a once in a 50-year opportunity. I've heard that from a number, and I think that there's probably something to that. Now, it's not just him, but also people in America, not the least of which is John Bolton, are suggesting that nuke sites might be on the table.
I don't buy the argument that they have necessarily agreed not to attack the nuclear and oil facilities. I think the nuclear program is a military program, and indeed it's the most dangerous program not just for Israel, but for the United States, and as a matter of counter-proliferation policy, really dangerous for the world as a whole.
So what do you think about that? Is since you've had some key Israelis talking about it, and then now and he's not the only Bolton's not the only American talking about this. How do you see that possibility?
Well, first of all, when we talk about Iran nuclear capabilities, this is a rhetoric we have heard many times in the U.S., but we know. And that has been established by the Atomic Energy International Energy Agency, that Iran has no program for developing nuclear weapons. And we know that. We know that also because you remember that in 2015, the EU, the US, Germany, and France, and Great Britain signed with Iran the so-called Joint Comprehensive Program of Action, designed at having Iran complying with some procedures in order to monitor its compliance with the Non-Proliferation Treaty and the non-production of nuclear weapons. And after a couple of years, the IAEA has noted that Iran complied with the JCPOA, and therefore it was then planned to remove the sanctions on Iran. And that's the point when Donald Trump decided to withdraw from the agreement, and that led the whole thing hanging in the air because the European allies didn't dare to stop the sanctions because the US had withdrawn without remove the sanctions, and therefore Iran is still hanging in the air with this treaty. In any case, it shows that the Iran has no nuclear program, and that was, as you just said, it was the CIA confirmed that Iran, and in fact, that was even, we have some declaration from the Mossad a few years ago that said that Iran has no nuclear weapons program. So we know that. So everything what we heard, but it's not very surprising from John Bolton, but what we hear from him is kind of let's say, he's just painting a threat that doesn't exist. But of course, it plays in the hand of Israel, who wants to drag, in fact, since the 50s, Israel tries to drag the US in the region. And that started, and that's something people have forgotten, especially in the US. But in the early 50s, in Egypt, the Israelis started a terrorist campaign against US and British interests.
Yeah.
And that led to a fantastic affair that became known under the name of the Lavon affair. That Lavon was the name of the Israeli Minister of Defense, because he had planned all this. The idea was to create a terrorist campaign that would force the US to come into the region to pacify Egypt. Later, in 1983, as we had the bombing of the U.S. Marines barrack in Beirut, a few years later, a Mossad agent named Viktor Ostrovsky, in his memoir, said or claimed that Israel knew that the barracks would be bombed, but they didn't tell that to the U.S. in order to have this bombing happening, hoping that the US would then have a permanent presence in the region. So I don't know if Ostrovsky is right. Nothing indicates that he was wrong, by the way. His book is well known. I don't have the title right now, but you can find it very easily. Viktor Ostrovsky, there are not many. That shows that for Israel, the idea of having the US permanently deployed in the region as a cover, if you want, in order to protect Israel, has always been, let's say, a historic constant, if I can. And that's, by the way, the whole issue that we had in Syria in 2011 and onwards, with the current presence of US forces in Syria, which is illegal, by the way. But this presence is part of this plan. And this has been constantly the idea of the Israelis. So what I see today in relation to this attack against Iran, because Israel has nothing to gain from any attack on Iran. The only gain would be that it would trigger a Western presence in the region, a kind of a peacekeeping or peace enforcement force or things like that.
Right. Then that kind of gets to the point here. Is the United States, and let's assume for the moment that we did intentionally leak that document to try and rein back any kind of an Israeli response. Are we trying to just be so-called a little bit pregnant? Is it going to matter if you parse it small and say, okay, instead of this massive campaign that you may have been planning, now only go after some high-level dignitary or person, whether it's the president or something like that, instead of a big campaign? Is that even going to matter? Because, and I'd like you to talk about this part next. What about the Iranian response? What is their position in this? I think you've said they don't want war. They've been trying to avoid it from the beginning. But is there a point beyond which they say, all right, that's it. Now then you've got a war whether we want it or not. Otherwise, we're going to end up losing our head of state.
Well, the problem is that, as I said, it's a kind of pissing contest. And in April, Iran retaliated or responded. And the response on the 1st of October was slightly different from the previous one. I mean, Iran had to raise the level a little bit. And it had to raise it in a way that is not too provocative to create something larger, but it had to be raised enough in order to have some kind of deterrent effect. So we are now in a very fine-tuned approach, and if, let's assume, the idea of Israel is to strike in a very precise way, let's say with the elimination of some dignitary in Iran. Iran would be forced to respond again. But then you see that the more you have Iran responses, the more you reach, or you are likely to reach, the level where you trigger a regional conflict. And that makes the response from Iran even more difficult. And Israel has a similar problem, by the way. So we might have that Iran would then respond not just with a massive strike with hypersonic missile, but could respond with a single supersonic missile on the residence of Netanyahu, for instance. We might have something like that. But the problem is that you cannot deterrence reach a certain level. There is a point where it's no longer deterrence and you are triggering something larger. And that's this fine-tuning which is currently going on, and I think extremely difficult on both sides. But the problem is that Israel is a country that lives out of war. It's a country that since its beginning, and I would say even before its existence, started with fighting others. I remind you that the resolution 181 from November 1947, by the way, that the CIA advised President Truman not to accept the resolution because it would precisely trigger exactly what we are witnessing today. It's a fantastic piece of analysis that the CIA made in October 1947. But in any case, what this resolution planned for referendums in order to have the compliance of all the parties to create these Arab and Jewish states. But the problem is that the Israeli never wanted to have any kind of referendum because the Arabs were more, the Arab population was bigger than the Jewish population. Therefore, it was a referendum would have been in favor of the Arabs. And for that reason, Israel decided to have or to impose its will through force. And that has been the case since then. And that's the reason why Israel is in a kind of logic that use force as a driver. The use of force is the driver of Israeli national security policy and even foreign policy, instead of having a foreign policy driven by cooperation with neighbors. And that's the problem, because Israel is in a kind of loop that has to increase the level of provocation each time. And remember that when on the 7th of October last year, as the Palestinians attacked the so-called Gaza envelope, one of the comments we could see in the Israeli papers and Israeli commentators was Israeli is losing its deterrent effect because it was attacked, it was taken by surprise, and therefore is losing its deterrent effect. This deterrence, driven by the use of the disproportionate and indiscriminate use of force, is a keystone of the Israeli foreign policy. And that's the reason why, regardless of all the resolution the UN has passed against Israel, Israel is in this loop. It cannot go backwards because the thinking, the mindset is that if we go backwards, that means we are losing, we are too weak. So this is tragic, in fact, because they are condemned to go always further.
Yeah. And in fact, that's exactly where I wanted to go next, because we've been talking about Iran so far, but that's only one of self-described 7 different fronts in this war. And I want to look at a couple of the others, because these are all concurrently going on. We have to figure out, what's going to happen and what may come next based on the comprehensive analysis of what they're doing. I want to shift gears real quick to the Hezbollah side in southern Lebanon and where some of that may be going. First of all, I want to show you another section from John Bolton where he was laying out what he thinks ought to be Israel's objectives.
I don't think you can negotiate with terrorists in good faith. That's not the way they are. And I think it's the systematic destruction of the terrorist threat that's necessary.
Will it require negotiation with Hezbollah in order to ensure a ceasefire in Lebanon?
Well, after their stockpile of missiles is destroyed, the CIA in its public fact book, obviously published long before this conflict broke out, estimated, this is what they say publicly, estimated that Hezbollah had up to 150,000 missiles. So I think if I were facing that terrorist threat, I wouldn't be satisfied until the threat had been eliminated.
Now, eliminated, that's a key point there, because that's what Israel had said about Hamas. They want to eliminate them and destroy them. Now it seems, okay, it's one thing for John Bolton to say whatever he thinks, but then listen to Yoav Gallant, who seemed to echo that.
רואים ממש פרוס לפנינו את כל קו הכפרים הראשון של חיזבאללה. מה שמאפיין את המקומות האלה זה שכל אחד ואחד מהם זה יעד צבאי ומוצב תת-קרקעי עם הרבה מאוד מנהרות, עם אמצעי אמל"ח. מצאו פה מאות RPG'ים, מקלעים, טילי נ"ט, ואת כל הדברים האלה צה"ל משמיד עכשיו, יעד אחר יעד, מתחת לאדמה ומעל לאדמה. כל מקום כזה לא רק שיושמד, אלא שלא מאפשר את חזרתם של המחבלים אל תוך המקומות האלה. זה דבר חיוני על מנת לשמור את ביטחונם של תושבי הצפון.
So when you look at the map of where the Israelis have sent evacuation orders to people in southern Lebanon, it's a long way. It's well beyond the Resolution 1701 blue line with the Litani River. It's way up north of that and could go even beyond that. This is starting to sound more like I'm going to eliminate everyone in the southern part of Lebanon.
Well, this is probably the case, and that's probably the reason why the Israeli demanded the withdrawal of the UNIFIL, the UN mission in South Lebanon. The problem is that we have to understand, and there is always this rhetoric. To be honest, I understand what terrorism is about, and there is a book just behind me that shows that I even wrote a book about fighting jihadi terrorism. So I'm not against this idea of terrorism. The problem is that when we start to use it politically, we tend to create some kind of trap, a political trap somehow, because on technical level, you and me understand what a terrorist is, but at political level, it has no real meaning. I mean, terrorism, first of all, the Hezbollah as well as the Hamas is defined as terrorists just by about 40 countries in the world, and the rest of the world doesn't consider them as terrorists. The second thing is that if we don't talk to terrorists, well, why did we talk to Israel? Because Israel was born out of terrorism. Remember that in September 1948, the Israelis killed the special envoy, the UN envoy, Conte Folke Bernadotte, who used, by the way, during World War II to save the life of something 33,000 Jews. And this guy was assassinated, but really assassinated by a terrorist group that was the Lehi, led by Yitzhak Shamir, who eventually became prime minister. So meaning that if we are consistent with this idea of not talking to terrorists, we should not talk to Israel either. So we see that there is a limit to that. Even if you are terrorists, there's a point where you have to say, okay, now the past is the past, and we have to go towards the future. And that's my first reaction. But now, when we talk about Lebanon, it's clear that the mere existence of Hezbollah is not to take over Israel. They don't want to invade Israel. And here we have also to make a difference between the Palestinians, who claim their right to have this territory of Palestine, which is between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River. And therefore, you have two people for one territory, if you want. And that's the Palestinian side. But on the Hezbollah and South Lebanon side, the Hezbollah was created because of the Israeli presence in South Lebanon. And according to the Taif Agreement of 1979, after the civil war in Lebanon, all groups decided, or armed groups decided, to disband. But the Hezbollah said, well, we'll disband as soon as Israel has completely left the Lebanese territory. And the fact is that Israel has never totally left South Lebanon. That's what they claim, but in fact, it's not true. They are not. They are still present on Lebanese territory, and that's the rationale for Hezbollah. By the way, when we see the tunnels and the bunkers and all that, these are defensive structures. These are not offensive structures, showing that the Hezbollah is prepared to defend its territory, but is not prepared to attack Israel. The fact of the matter is that in the recent months, since Israel bombed, because nothing had started 3 weeks ago, in fact, since the 8th of October last year, you have already more than 2,300 Lebanese people who have been killed by Israel. We don't talk about those victims, but there are, according to the Lebanese Ministry of Health, something like 2,300 Lebanese have been killed by Israeli strikes. So the Hezbollah has tried to create around the in the northern part of Israel a buffer zone, and has managed to do so because Israel has taken out all it has taken the population, the Israeli population, back to the center of the country, and you have a band of territory along the Lebanese border, which is now kind of a no man's land. Now Israel wants to do the same on Lebanese territory, and that's the reason why we have this attempt for Israel to invade the southern part of Israel, to ask the UNIFIL to withdraw, and to bomb to destroy. In fact, they want to do in South Lebanon what they have done in Gaza. Problem is that, as we have seen in Gaza, this doesn't lead nowhere. I mean, it's not, because the destruction, the killing of civilian population, the disproportionate attack of Israel will not bring peace to Israel. On the contrary. And in addition to that, there is something that we have also to take into consideration. And that was published recently by the Jerusalem Post, something we knew already, is that people like the Ben Gvir and Smotrich, these guys are biblically driven, if you want, and they claim they want to reach the large Israel, the Eretz Israel, which is the large Israel that extend over the border, the Lebanese border, that extend up to the Euphrates, in fact, in Iraq. And Smotrich said recently that they will not stop until they reach Damascus. So we see that we have here something different that adds to the, let's say, legitimate, because I understand the need for Israel to protect its population. The question is whether it has the best strategy to do that.
Yeah.
And that's the question, because destroying its neighbors will just increase the level of hatred in the region and the willingness of revenge. And we have seen already in 2006, the Hezbollah was not defeated despite all the destruction and all the killing. So we are in a kind of logic that Israel, in my view, is totally, we are talking about something which is totally irrational. And I have to say, in that particular case, the Hezbollah seems to me to be a rational actor in that sense.
Hey, let me ask you a question on the Hezbollah side. One thing that's kind of puzzled me from the beginning, that John Bolton spoke to there a second ago, in that this claim that Hezbollah had this massive arsenal of rockets, 150,000, many of which were much more modern than what Hamas had, say, down in the Gaza Strip. But to date, I think we had a headline from earlier today where 50 rockets were fired, and these were apparently some of the lower end of the capabilities. One or two, I think, actually hit something. Very often, none get through at all. And one wonders, was that a false claim? Did they not have these massive arsenal, or is there some other reason why they haven't used them? How do you see that?
Well, it's a good question. I think nobody knows except probably the guy in charge of logistics and operations in Hezbollah. But the thing is that, as it is the case when you try to have a kind of deterrent policy, you should have let your enemy think that you have these capabilities, and that's probably part of the game. I have no idea. Apparently, the Hezbollah has technological capabilities that Israel was not expecting. We see now that they have drones that can move freely in all the northern part of Israel up to Tel Aviv, and undetected. And we had recently those example of those drones that reached the residence of Netanyahu. And we had early this year, we had several movies that were published by Hezbollah showing reconnaissance flights of some drones. And in those movies, the Hezbollah indicated potential military targets. There were 2 or 3 movies of 9 minutes, right, and something each, that were showing that Hezbollah was able to fly a reconnaissance flight over the whole northern part of Israel, identifying targets to signal and kind of tag those targets without being intercepted. And that's, by the way, triggered some concern in the Israeli General Staff. And this is something that surprised, in fact, Israel. And we have also some missiles, including short-range missiles that have some TV on camera in the front that help to monitor the flights. And we see that the distractions done by Hezbollah are certainly, I mean, that documents the Hezbollah successes. Now, there are probably some other missiles that are more powerful that Hezbollah has not used yet. We know that there are other militias, by the way, because we don't talk about the Iraqi militias, but you may remember that on a couple of times, Iraqi militias launched cruise missiles that targeted some oil facilities in the port of Haifa in Israel. Yeah. So that's about 500 kilometers trip, and that shows that even those militias or armored group in Iraq have quite sophisticated capabilities. My view is that the Hezbollah has not unveiled all its capabilities. And when Hezbollah sends missiles that are intercepted, it's because they want them to be intercepted. If they want to have an effect without being intercepted, they can do it. So we have here an enemy that they had almost 20 years to prepare themselves, because they knew that at some point Israel would come back. I mean, Israel has attacked already four times the South Lebanon. So there is no question that they will come back again. So the problem is whether you want to achieve a decisive victory against Israel, or if you are able to deter them some way without having a decisive victory. So that's a little bit the question.
I think that while we haven't seen these missiles fly, by most of the evidence we can actually see, Hezbollah has been quite effective in the tactical fight and inflicting casualties on the IDF, hitting Merkava tanks and causing lots of personnel casualties, and definitely slow going. Even though they are making success in penetrations, it has not come at a low price. But that's also not the only thing that's going on here. So it's not just Iran potentially in a minute, and then Hezbollah right now, but we still, of course, have what's going on in the Hamas fight. That's nowhere near being over, even if it's on a much lower level than it has been. But then even today, now Syria is still at play. Is the IDF had launched more attacks again into Syria. And then one has to wonder, what is the upshot? What is the intent of all of this? Because we can also add in the Houthis in Yemen, with Israel and the United States continues to periodically strike. Where is all of this going? Because these things all imply we're fighting on every front by our choice. Okay, October 7th happened to them last year. That was, a narrow area which was fenced off, and everything was relied there. But now that Israel has chosen to expand into all these different areas, what do you think is the end game?
Well, as we said, Israel needs to have, I mean, that's probably what the current leadership in Israel wants. They consider that they are in a difficult position, and if they want to achieve a decisive success, they need to have the decisive battle. They have to have a regional conflict in which the U.S. is involved, and I think that's all the effort that Israel is trying to do, is to have the U.S. involved in the conflict. I mean, if you remember that you have U.S. presence in Syria, attacking objectives in Syria, and that's what happened in the past, by the way. In the last year, you had several attacks that were performed by Iraqi and Syrian armed groups against the U.S. bases in Iraq and in Syria. And that's probably what Israel is trying to do, to somehow commit or force the US to commit themselves to the conflict. And that's, in my view, the only way for Israel to achieve some kind of success. Because what we have addressed today in this program so far, we have talked about tactical issues, operational issues to some extent, but on the strategic level, Israel is losing big, by the way, because it has lost a lot of credibility. It is in the UN system. Recently, we just had this report coming out explaining that Israel has a concerted policy of destroying hospitals and medical facilities in Gaza, and they document that. It's a quite an extensive report that was written in September, dated is the September this year, and it was released, I think, on the 10th of October, and it shows that Israel has a policy of attacking first medical facilities and hospitals and torturing medical personnel and things like this. So that means that at strategic level, Israel has already lost this war. So they are in difficulty in Gaza, they are in difficulty in South Lebanon, they are in difficulty in the West Bank. They are not able to deter the Houthis to shoot missiles or even hypersonic missiles. And now the only unknown is how they will respond to Iran. We have discussed that before. But essentially, we are talking about a country which is on the defensive, which is, I mean, it's an offensive defensive somehow, because it is condemned to increase the level of violence in his mind, and that makes it extremely dangerous.
Well, and that is not lost on the Israeli government. So while the United States is doing everything it can to try and curtail this and bring all these immediate ceasefires in Gaza, we wanted a 21-day ceasefire in southern Lebanon. We're trying to keep both Iran and Israel from going after each other. They are actually taking concrete steps to perpetuate this war over a long period of time.
Exactly.
This report just out here is that Israel is preparing to expand its defense budget continually through the year 2028. And then, as you see there at the bottom, it says, in short, it is evident that Israel is moving towards a profound shift in the structure of its military based on a long-term war that aligned with its regional ambitions. So in that sense, I guess it's not even a defensive situation. That all of these wars are apparently aimed at thinking it's going to conquer different territory and create this so-called greater Israel, for lack of a better term. And that seems to be their full intent, meaning the implication are that if they do something minor to Iran right now to placate, it won't be because they're looking to avoid a conflict. It seems like at some point it's going to be inevitable that they're going to try and take Iran out by, I suppose you're right, drawing the United States in.
No, I totally agree with you. The word defensive that I used was probably not exactly what I meant. What I meant is that they are hiding behind a defensive situation in order to generate an offensive posture. That's what I meant. But you're absolutely right. And the problem is that everybody starts to understand that. But there is also one point that is, for me, a source of concern, is that we see that before, the US were able to, with a phone call, to influence the decision in the Israeli government. And today it's no longer the case. The US government has lost all its influence, both on Zelensky and on Netanyahu. And that means that nobody rational is in control. And that's for me the source, because when we talk about a political solution to the conflict, well, who are we looking at? Who is able to provide a political solution? That will certainly not come from government who are, let's say, a kind of a messianic, in a kind of messianic mood. And so that can come only from an external actor, such as the European Union or the US or whoever, maybe China or somewhere else. But EU diplomatically is totally inexistent. There is absolutely no EU diplomacy. And even countries within EU, such as France or Great Britain or Germany, they are totally absent either. So they are unable to have some kind of leverage over the Israeli government. As a result, the US were the only, let's say, force or power that could influence the decision making in Israel. And as we see, this is no longer the case.
But well, and then to kind of underscore that, here is the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, who's supposed to be, position-wise, one of the most powerful positions on the planet, even more powerful than many heads of state. Listen to the language he chooses to use, his facial expressions, body language, when he's talking about influencing his counterpart in Israel.
The numbers of civilian casualties have been far too high. We'd like to see Israel scale back on some of the strikes that it's taking, especially in and around Beirut. And we'd like to see things transition to some sort of negotiation that would allow civilians on both sides of the border to return to their homes. That's the point that I'll continue to make with Minister Gallant. And I think, yes, he does take on my
Does he though? Does he take on his input?
No. Well, that's exactly the problem. He is powerless. And we see a very similar things with Ukraine currently. And that's a little bit worrying because, okay, we know that the US government has always been very in favor of peace everywhere, and we can criticize US governments for that. But at the same time, the US had this ability to have some kind of control over the situation around the world. But today it's no longer the case. That means that they just launch crisis, but the US is not able to master this crisis after a while, and they are not able to manage them and to control them, to keep them down when necessary. So this is something which is a little bit worrying.
So let me ask you a question. If the United States is not playing its restraining power that it has, and it has lots of leverage, we certainly could do it. We just don't have the personal capability. But let's say that that's in fact accurate, and it's no longer valid. It's neutered itself. Can Israel succeed in what it's setting out to do, as you see that are physically making financial plans to expand their army and to do all these things? Militarily speaking, what you know about the region from your books of understanding how the mindset of some of these jihadi groups or the groups that are opposed to Israel, how they think, etc. Can Israel, let's say by 2028, actually conquer the region?
Well, it has probably the capability and the capacity to destroy its neighbor country. The problem is, how long will those countries wait without doing anything? That's the real question, because we see that more and more Arab countries who were aligned on the US and they were kind of disciplined and tried to keep a neutral stance in this conflict. Now you have more moves within these countries that tend to push the government towards war against Israel. We see that in Jordan, for instance. Remember that a large part of the Jordanian population is Palestinian in essence. And for years, the Jordan population was the Jordan managed to keep a very neutral position in the conflict. But when I was in Jordan, that was a couple of years ago, I was in mission for NATO and talking to some Jordanian officer. When I was talking privately with these guys about the situation in Israel, there is no doubt that these guys are definitely not in favor of neutrality towards Israel. And that was well before the 9th of October, the 7th of October last year, meaning that the level of distraction and the level of, let's say, denial of international law, of the level of killing of civilians and all that, starts to trigger in the Arab population, in the whole region, a sense that Israel is a problem. And at one point, my fear is that there will be a point where all these are, including those like Saudi Arabia, who used to be moderate in a certain sense, there will be a point where they decide that let's stop that, and let's have a decisive action, because Israel doesn't want to have let's say peaceful relationship with its neighbors. That's the problem. That's what people understand in the region, and that's the reason why it might reach a point where nobody wants to talk to Israel anymore. Today we are still in the phase where people are ready to talk, but that may well be at an end at one point. And that's what my concern. That's the reason why I think that Israel will manage to have huge destructions in the region. But
even that's only going to be enabled by the United States continuing a nonstop supply of ammunition, right? Weapons, military, arms, missiles, etc., which I'm not 100% sure that we can keep it going that many years into the future.
Well, the problem is here that the question is about U.S. domestic policies, because, as you know, the lobbies and all that within the U.S. are, according to me, this is the reason why the U.S. is so hesitant to have decisive political action towards Israel and have a very frank type of discussion with Netanyahu. It's because of the pressure that we have, and that's probably bipartisan, in a sense that I'm not sure it's a question of Democrats or Republican or Trump or Biden. There might be some differences here and there, but in essence, the power of these lobbies in the U.S. are the strongest aspect of this inability of the U.S. to have a decisive leverage on Israel, and that will continue. That's why you have this kind of carrots and stick policy. We want to have a ceasefire, but we still provide weapons, and we provide defensive weapons, whatever defensive means, and things like that. And you need to have a president, or less a president, that has a very strong personality and a willingness to say no, to say let's, and probably the leverage would be, if we want to preserve the existence of Israel, then we would stop to feed Israel.